Emily and her husband, David, had just moved into their dream home, a century-old Victorian house in a quiet neighborhood. The house had been on the market for years, and the previous owner seemed eager to sell it quickly. Most of the furniture was left behind, including an old rocking chair in the attic they hadn't yet explored. On their first night, Emily heard faint creaks coming from above their bedroom. She dismissed it as the house settling, but the sound had an oddly rhythmic quality. David joked about ghosts, but Emily couldn't shake her unease about the attic. When they tried to open the attic door, they found it locked, with no key in sight. That night, Emily dreamed of footsteps pacing back and forth above her head. She woke up to find David staring at the ceiling, his face pale and tense. "I heard it too," he whispered. "Something, walking." The next morning, they decided to investigate further. David searched through drawers and closets for a key to the attic but found nothing. Meanwhile, Emily noticed something strange. The rocking chair upstairs was slightly visible through a crack in the ceiling. It was moving slowly, back and forth, as if someone invisible was sitting there. She called David over, but by the time he looked, it had stopped completely. "You're just tired," he said dismissively, though his voice lacked conviction. That evening, Emily left her phone recording audio while they slept to capture any sounds. When she played it back in the morning, her blood ran cold at what she heard. Faint footsteps echoed through the recording, followed by a low whisper, "Get out." Emily and David stared at each other in silence. David suggested calling a locksmith to open the attic door and put their fears to rest. When the locksmith arrived, he hesitated as soon as he saw the door. "This lock is unusual," he muttered, running his fingers over its surface. It wasn't just old, it looked handmade, with strange symbols etched into the metal. After some effort, he managed to unlock it but refused to step inside. "You two should be careful," he said before leaving abruptly without explanation. Emily and David climbed up cautiously into the attic, flashlights cutting through thick dust. The rocking chair sat in the center of the room, facing away from them toward a small window. Boxes were stacked haphazardly around it, filled with old photographs and newspapers from decades past. But what caught Emily's attention was a single word carved into the wooden floorboards: "Stay." Emily felt an overwhelming chill as she stared at the word carved into the floorboards. David tried to laugh it off as a prank by previous owners but didn't sound convincing even to himself. They decided not to touch anything for now and left the attic door open for ventilation. That night, Emily woke up suddenly to find David sitting upright in bed, staring at her blankly. His eyes were wide open but unfocused as if he were in some kind of trance. "David," she whispered nervously, shaking his shoulder gently. He didn't respond at first. Then he spoke in a voice that wasn't his own, low and raspy, "You shouldn't have opened it." Emily screamed as David snapped out of his trance, confused and disoriented by her reaction. He claimed not to remember anything and insisted she must have imagined it all. But Emily knew what she heard, and she couldn't ignore it. Over the next few days, strange occurrences became more frequent around the house. Lights flickered randomly despite having new bulbs installed just weeks ago. Doors would creak open on their own even when tightly shut moments earlier. Emily began hearing faint whispers during quiet moments when she was alone at home. One afternoon while cleaning upstairs, she noticed something horrifying on their bedroom mirror, a handprint, small and childlike, pressed into the foggy glass from inside the room. She called David immediately, but by the time he arrived home from work, it was gone again. "You're scaring yourself," he said gently but firmly as if trying to calm her down, and himself too. That night, while lying awake in bed together, they both heard it clearly this time, footsteps above them again, louder than ever before. The footsteps above grew louder, pacing back and forth as if someone, or something, was restless. David grabbed a flashlight and insisted they check the attic again, despite Emily's protests. As they climbed the creaking stairs, the air grew colder with each step. The rocking chair was still there, but this time it wasn't empty. A doll sat on the chair, a porcelain figure with cracked features and lifeless eyes. Emily gasped. "That wasn't here before," she said, her voice trembling. David hesitated but picked up the doll, examining it closely. Its dress was stained with something dark, and its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Emily screamed as David dropped the doll, its head shattering on the floor. They rushed to open the attic door, but it wouldn't budge no matter how hard they pushed. The temperature in the room plummeted, their breath visible in the icy air. A low hum filled the attic, an unnatural sound that seemed to vibrate through their bones. Emily's flashlight flickered before going out completely, plunging them into darkness. "David," she cried out, fumbling for his hand in the pitch-black room. "I'm here," he said shakily, though his voice sounded distant despite being close. Suddenly, a faint glow appeared near the rocking chair, a pale light that illuminated nothing else. In the glow, they saw a shadowy figure standing motionless behind the chair. Its form was human-like but distorted, with limbs too long and a face obscured by darkness. The hum grew louder as the figure slowly turned toward them. Emily froze in terror as the figure took a step forward, its shadow stretching unnaturally across the floor. David grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the door, pounding on it desperately. "Let us out," he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space of the attic. The figure stopped moving but tilted its head as if observing them curiously. Then came a whisper, soft yet deafening, "You were warned." The attic door suddenly flew open with such force that it nearly knocked them over. They bolted down the stairs without looking back, slamming the door shut behind them. Emily turned to David, tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave this house." But David shook his head, his expression grim. "No one will believe us." That night, they slept in their car parked outside, but even there, Emily felt watched. The next morning, Emily called a local historian to learn more about their house's past. The man hesitated before speaking. "That house has a reputation." He explained that previous owners had reported strange occurrences dating back decades. One family abandoned it after their child went missing, last seen playing in the attic. Another owner claimed to hear voices at night and eventually disappeared without a trace. Emily's stomach churned as she listened to story after story of tragedy tied to their home. "Whatever is in that house," the historian said gravely, "it doesn't want you there." David remained skeptical but agreed to stay at a motel for a few nights while they figured things out. That evening at the motel, Emily woke up to find David gone from bed. She heard faint whispers coming from outside their room. Emily opened the door cautiously and found David standing in the parking lot, staring at nothing. "David," she called softly, stepping closer to him under the dim motel lights. He turned to face her slowly, his eyes blank and unseeing like before. "You can't run," he said in that same raspy voice from before. "It's already inside you." Emily backed away in terror as David collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. When he finally came to, he had no memory of what had just happened. "We need help," Emily said firmly, dialing a paranormal investigator she'd found online earlier that day. The investigator agreed to meet them at their house to conduct an assessment of the energy. Reluctantly, they returned home with him 2 days later, armed with cameras and recording equipment. But as soon as they stepped inside, Emily knew something was different. The house felt heavier, as if the air itself resisted their presence. The paranormal investigator, a middle-aged man named Carl, immediately sensed the tension. "This place has a strong residual energy," he murmured, setting up his equipment. Emily and David stayed close together as Carl walked through the house with a recorder. In the attic, Carl froze when he saw the rocking chair. It was now facing the door. He placed a motion detector near it and began asking questions aloud. "Who are you? Why are you here?" Carl's voice echoed in the stillness. For a moment, nothing happened, and Emily exhaled in relief. Then, the motion detector beeped. Something had moved near the chair. Carl's recorder crackled to life with a voice that wasn't his own. "You shouldn't have come back." Carl played back the recording, and Emily's blood ran cold at the clarity of the voice. David tried to stay calm but couldn't hide his growing fear. "What does it want?" he asked. Carl shook his head, visibly shaken. "It's not just one entity, there's more than one presence here." Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and their breath became visible in the attic's icy air. The rocking chair began to move on its own, creaking slowly back and forth. Emily grabbed David's arm as Carl aimed his camera toward the chair. Through the viewfinder, he saw something they couldn't, a shadowy figure sitting in it. "It's watching us," Carl whispered, lowering the camera with trembling hands. Before anyone could react, the attic door slammed shut again, trapping them inside. A loud banging sound echoed from beneath the floorboards, as if something was trying to break through. Emily screamed as cracks began forming on the attic floor, spreading like spiderwebs. From those cracks seeped a dark liquid, thick and tar-like, that pulsed unnaturally. Carl shouted for them to stay back as he tried to force open the door again. The liquid began forming shapes on the floor, letters that spelled out one word: leave. David grabbed Emily's hand, pulling her toward Carl as panic set in. The rocking chair suddenly stopped moving, and an eerie silence filled the room. Then came laughter, soft at first but growing louder until it echoed from every corner of the attic. The shadowy figure emerged from behind the chair, its distorted limbs stretching unnaturally toward them. Carl recited a prayer under his breath as he threw open a vial of salt toward it. The figure recoiled momentarily but didn't disappear, it only grew angrier. The attic began to shake violently as objects flew off shelves and smashed against walls. Carl shouted for Emily and David to run as he tried to hold off whatever was attacking them. They managed to force open the door and stumbled down the stairs in terror. Behind them, they heard Carl cry out before everything went silent again. When they turned back, there was no sign of him. The attic door hung open ominously. David wanted to go back for him, but Emily pulled him toward the front door instead. "We can't help him," she said through tears, dragging him outside into the cold night air. As they reached their car, Emily glanced back at the house one last time. In the attic window stood Carl, or what looked like him, staring down at them with lifeless eyes. "That's not him," she whispered as they sped away. Emily and David never returned to that house again. They sold it at a loss within weeks. But even after moving far away, strange things continued to happen around them. Emily would wake up at night hearing faint whispers or footsteps outside their bedroom door. David began having vivid nightmares of being trapped in an endless attic with no way out. One day, Emily found an old photograph tucked into her belongings, a picture of their attic rocking chair. In it sat a shadowy figure with glowing eyes, holding what looked like Carl's camera in its hands. They tried burning it, but no matter what they did, it always reappeared somewhere else in their home. Desperate for answers, they contacted another investigator who agreed to help, but vanished before their meeting date. Local legends about their old house began circulating online, stories of people disappearing or going mad after visiting it. And somewhere in that cursed attic, the rocking chair still waits for its next occupant. Jake loved driving late at night, enjoying the solitude of empty highways. One foggy evening, as he cruised along a desolate stretch of road, he noticed a figure ahead. It was a woman standing by the side of the road, wearing a long white dress. Her face was obscured by her hair, and she didn't move as his car approached. Against his better judgment, Jake slowed down and rolled down the passenger side window. "Do you need a ride?" he asked hesitantly, his voice breaking the eerie silence. The woman nodded slowly but didn't speak as she climbed into the back seat. Jake felt an unnatural chill fill the car, even though the heater was on. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, but her face was still hidden by her hair. Something about her presence made his skin crawl, but he kept driving. The woman remained silent as Jake tried to make small talk to ease the tension. "Where are you headed?" he asked, glancing at her in the mirror again. Her voice was soft but distant when she finally spoke, "Just keep driving." Jake felt a shiver run down his spine at her vague response but nodded anyway. The fog outside grew thicker, swallowing the road in front of them. "Are you from around here?" he asked, trying again to start a conversation. This time, she didn't answer, she simply stared out of the window. Jake noticed something strange, her reflection in the rearview mirror flickered briefly. It was as if she wasn't entirely there, like static on an old TV screen. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as unease began to creep into his mind. Jake decided to focus on the road and ignore the growing sense of dread in his chest. But then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper, "You shouldn't be out here." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, glancing at her reflection again. It was gone this time. His heart raced as he turned his head slightly to check the back seat directly. She was still there, sitting perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. "Turn left," she said suddenly, pointing toward a narrow dirt road that appeared out of nowhere. Jake hesitated but followed her instructions, unsure why he trusted her at all. The dirt road twisted through dense trees that seemed to close in on them with every turn. "How much farther?" Jake asked nervously, but she didn't respond this time. Instead, she began humming softly, a haunting melody that made his blood run cold. The humming grew louder as they drove deeper into the woods, and Jake's nerves frayed further. He glanced at her again and noticed something horrifying. Her hands were covered in blood. "What happened to you?" he stammered, his voice shaking as panic set in. She tilted her head slightly but didn't answer, her humming continued uninterrupted. Jake slammed on the brakes and turned around to confront her directly. But when he looked at the back seat again, it was empty. She had vanished completely. His breathing quickened as he scanned the area outside. There was no sign of her anywhere. The fog seemed thicker now, almost alive as it pressed against his car windows like a shroud. Suddenly, Jake's radio crackled to life with static before a voice broke through, "You shouldn't have stopped." A shadow moved across his windshield, something was out there. Jake's instincts screamed at him to leave immediately, but his hands felt frozen on the wheel. The shadow outside circled his car slowly, its form indistinct but menacing in its movements. When it passed by his headlights briefly, Jake caught a glimpse of it, a humanoid figure with glowing eyes. It wasn't human, that much was clear, and it seemed to be searching for something, or someone. Jake fumbled with his keys and managed to restart the engine just as the figure approached again. He floored the gas pedal and sped down the dirt road without looking back this time. The radio continued crackling with faint voices, some crying, others whispering incoherently in languages he didn't recognize. As he reached what looked like an intersection ahead, Jake realized something chilling. This wasn't where he'd started from earlier tonight, it was somewhere else entirely now. Jake's hands trembled as he gripped the wheel, realizing the road ahead wasn't familiar. The trees seemed taller, their branches arching over the path like skeletal hands. The radio crackled again, but this time it was clearer. Turn back, before it's too late. Jake's heart pounded as he glanced at the rearview mirror. She was back. The woman sat silently in the back seat, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. "Where are we?" Jake stammered, his voice barely audible over the static. She didn't answer but raised her hand to point toward another narrow path ahead. "You have to take me home," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally in the small car. Jake hesitated but felt compelled to obey, as if an unseen force guided his actions. He turned onto the path, his headlights illuminating a decrepit house in the distance. The house looked ancient, its wooden frame warped and rotting under the weight of time. Jake stopped the car and turned to face her, but once again, she was gone. The passenger door creaked open on its own, as if inviting him to step outside. Against every instinct screaming at him to leave, Jake found himself walking toward the house. The air grew colder with each step, and the fog thickened around him like a suffocating blanket. The front door swung open before he could touch it, revealing a dark hallway inside. "Hello?" Jake called out, his voice echoing into the void. A faint light flickered at the end of the hallway, drawing him deeper into the house. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Jake turned around frantically but found only darkness where the door had been. The hallway stretched impossibly long now, with doors on either side that hadn't been there before. Whispers echoed from behind those doors, some pleading for help, others laughing cruelly. Jake moved cautiously toward the flickering light at the end of the corridor. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if something unseen was trying to hold him back. When he reached the light, he found himself in a small room with peeling wallpaper and broken furniture. On a dusty table sat an old photograph of a family, parents and a young girl in a white dress. Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized her. It was the hitchhiker he'd picked up earlier. Suddenly, footsteps echoed behind him, and he turned to see her standing in the doorway. Her face was finally visible, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered before disappearing into thin air. Jake stumbled back into the hallway, desperate to find an exit from this nightmare. But no matter which direction he turned, every door led back to that same room with the photograph. The whispers grew louder now, overlapping into an incomprehensible cacophony of voices. He clutched his head in frustration as shadows began creeping along the walls toward him. One shadow took shape, a tall figure with glowing eyes that radiated malice and hunger. It reached out toward Jake with elongated fingers that seemed to stretch across dimensions. Panicking, Jake bolted down the hallway again, ignoring the doors and focusing on running. The walls around him began warping and closing in as if trying to swallow him whole. Finally, he saw what looked like an exit, a faint outline of light at the end of another corridor. But just as he reached it, something grabbed his ankle and yanked him backward. Jake hit the ground hard as cold fingers wrapped around his leg like iron clamps. He kicked frantically, managing to free himself just long enough to crawl toward the light ahead. Behind him came guttural growls and scraping sounds. Something was chasing him now. He burst through what felt like a doorway and found himself outside again, or so he thought. The house was gone, replaced by an endless stretch of fog-covered road beneath a blood-red sky. His car sat idling nearby as if waiting for him, but it wasn't where he'd left it earlier. Jake climbed inside quickly and slammed the door shut before starting the engine again. The radio crackled once more. "You can't escape, you're part of this now." Terrified but determined to leave, Jake floored the gas pedal and sped down the empty road ahead. But no matter how far he drove, everything looked exactly the same. Jake drove for what felt like hours, but the road never changed. The same twisted trees lined the highway, and the same thick fog clung to the edges. His hands ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, but he didn't dare slow down. The radio continued to crackle, now playing faint snippets of music from decades past. Then, a voice broke through again, "You can't leave until it's finished." Jake slammed his fist against the dashboard in frustration. "What do you want from me?" he yelled. The car suddenly lurched as if it had hit something, and Jake slammed on the brakes. He stepped out cautiously, his heart pounding, but there was nothing on the road. When he turned back toward the car, she was sitting in the driver's seat. Her hollow eyes stared at him through the windshield as she whispered, "Get in." Jake hesitated, every instinct telling him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The woman tilted her head and smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach her eyes. "You started this," she said softly, her voice carrying over the still air. "Now finish it." Against his will, Jake climbed into the passenger seat as she slid over to make room. The car began moving on its own, the steering wheel turning under her ghostly hands. Jake watched helplessly as the road ahead twisted into something unrecognizable, dark and endless. The trees seemed to bleed shadows that reached toward the car like grasping hands. "Where are we going?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer but began humming that same haunting melody from before. Jake closed his eyes, praying this was just a nightmare he'd soon wake up from. When Jake opened his eyes again, they were parked in front of an old cemetery. The fog parted just enough to reveal rows of crumbling tombstones covered in moss. The woman stepped out of the car and motioned for Jake to follow her. "I don't want to go," he said weakly, but his body moved against his will. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, Jake noticed something strange about the graves. Each tombstone bore a name he recognized, friends, family members, even his own name etched into stone. "This isn't real," he muttered to himself, shaking his head in disbelief. "It can't be real." The woman stopped in front of one grave and pointed at it silently. Jake's blood ran cold when he saw the date of death. It matched that very night. "You were never meant to leave," she said softly before vanishing into thin air. Jake stumbled back toward the car, desperate to escape this nightmare once and for all. But when he reached it, the car was gone, replaced by an empty stretch of road. The fog closed in around him like a living thing, suffocating and disorienting him further. Voices echoed all around him now, whispers of people calling his name from every direction. He turned frantically, trying to find where they were coming from but saw nothing but shadows. Then he heard her voice again, "You can't run from what you are." A figure emerged from the fog. It was him, or at least something that looked like him. The doppelganger smiled cruelly before stepping closer and whispering, "You belong here now." Jake tried to scream but found no sound would come out as darkness swallowed him whole. Days later, Highway Patrol found Jake's abandoned car on a deserted stretch of road. There was no sign of him anywhere, just faint footprints leading into the forest nearby. Locals whispered about strange occurrences on that highway, disappearing travelers and ghostly figures at night. Some claimed to have seen Jake's car driving aimlessly along the road with no driver inside. Others spoke of hearing a haunting melody carried on the wind late at night near that stretch of highway. Jake's story became another legend tied to those cursed roads, a warning for those who dared travel them alone. And somewhere along that endless fog-covered highway, she still waits for her next ride.
For friends, Liam, Rachel, Mike, and Zoe decided to camp in Blackwood Forest for the weekend. The forest was infamous among locals for its eerie silence and strange disappearances. But the group laughed off the warnings, eager for an adventure away from the city. They set up camp near a clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to loom over them. As night fell, the usual sounds of nature, crickets, rustling leaves, were absent. "I don't like this," Rachel said, glancing nervously at the dark woods around them. Mike rolled his eyes. "It's just a forest. Relax." But Zoe swore she heard faint whispers coming from deeper in the trees. It sounded like voices, overlapping and indistinct, but no one else seemed to hear it. They dismissed her concerns and huddled around the campfire, trying to shake off the unease. As they roasted marshmallows, Liam noticed something strange about the firelight. The shadows it cast on the trees didn't match their movements. They seemed to shift on their own. "Do you see that?" he asked, pointing toward one of the trees at the edge of the clearing. The others turned to look but saw nothing unusual, brushing it off as paranoia. Zoe excused herself to use the bathroom and disappeared into the woods with a flashlight. Minutes passed, then an hour, but Zoe didn't return. Rachel began to panic, calling out her name into the dark forest with no response. Mike grabbed his flashlight and insisted they all go look for her together. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the whispers Zoe had mentioned grew louder. This time, all of them could hear it, a faint chorus of voices calling their names. The deeper they went into the forest, the louder and clearer the whispers became. It wasn't just random sounds, it was their own voices being mimicked perfectly. "Liam!" A voice called softly from somewhere ahead, sounding exactly like Rachel's tone. Rachel froze in place, gripping Liam's arm tightly. "That wasn't me," she whispered. Mike tried to stay calm but couldn't hide his growing fear as shadows moved among the trees. "Zoe!" he shouted desperately, his voice echoing back at him with an unnatural distortion. Suddenly, they heard footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, approaching from where they'd come. When they turned around, Zoe was standing there, but something was wrong with her face. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, her expression blank as if she were in a trance. "I saw it," she whispered softly before collapsing to the ground. They carried Zoe back to camp and tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond at first. When she finally opened her eyes, she looked terrified and disoriented. "It told me not to leave," she said shakily, clutching Rachel's hand for comfort. "What told you that?" Liam asked nervously as Mike stoked the dying campfire for warmth. Zoe hesitated before answering, "The forest. It's alive." Her words sent chills through everyone as they exchanged uneasy glances around the firelight. Rachel suggested packing up and leaving immediately, but Mike insisted they wait until morning. "We'll get lost in the dark," he argued, though his voice betrayed his own fear of staying longer. As they debated what to do next, a low hum began resonating through the clearing like a heartbeat. The flames of their campfire flickered violently before extinguishing completely. Darkness swallowed the clearing as the fire went out, leaving them in total silence. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, clutching Liam's arm as her flashlight flickered. Before anyone could answer, the whispers returned, louder, closer, and more distinct. They weren't just hearing their names anymore. The voices were laughing and crying all at once. Mike shone his flashlight into the trees, but the beam seemed to dissolve into the darkness. Then, from the edge of the clearing, they saw movement, shadows weaving between the trees. Zoe sat up suddenly, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," she said in a voice not her own. "What's coming?" Mike shouted, but Zoe only pointed toward the forest with trembling hands. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that pierced the night. The figure didn't move like a human. It glided between the trees without making a sound. Rachel screamed as it stopped at the edge of the clearing, tilting its head unnaturally. Mike grabbed a branch and lit it with his lighter, creating a makeshift torch for protection. But as soon as he stepped forward, the figure vanished into thin air. "Where did it go?" Liam asked, his voice shaking as he scanned the darkness around them. Zoe began muttering under her breath, repeating a phrase none of them could understand. Rachel leaned closer to hear, "Stay, stay, stay." Zoe whispered over and over again. Suddenly, a deafening roar erupted from deep within the forest, shaking the ground violently. The trees bent unnaturally toward them as if being pulled by an unseen force. "We need to leave," Liam shouted, grabbing Zoe and pulling her to her feet. The group ran blindly through the forest, their flashlights barely piercing the suffocating darkness. The whispers followed them, growing louder with every step they took away from camp. Rachel tripped over a root and fell hard to the ground, scraping her knees. Liam stopped to help her up, but froze when he saw something ahead of them, a second Zoe. She stood motionless in their path, staring at them with lifeless eyes and a twisted smile. "That's not me," Zoe whispered from behind Liam, clutching his arm tightly. The doppelganger tilted its head before letting out an inhuman screech that echoed through the forest. Mike swung his torch at it desperately, but it disappeared into black mist before he could reach it. As they continued running, they realized they were going in circles. The same trees kept reappearing. "No matter where we go," Rachel panted, "it won't let us leave." Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled upon an old cabin hidden deep within the woods. The cabin looked abandoned but strangely untouched by time, its windows intact and door slightly ajar. "This is our only chance," Mike said, pushing open the door despite Zoe's protests to stay away. Inside was a single room filled with strange carvings on the walls and floorboards. Symbols none of them recognized seemed to pulsate faintly in the dim light of their flashlights. A table in the center held an old journal covered in dust and cobwebs. Liam opened it cautiously and flipped through its pages filled with frantic handwriting. "The forest takes what it wants," one entry read. "It feeds on fear and never lets go." Another page showed crude drawings of shadowy figures surrounding people, just like what they'd seen earlier. Suddenly, footsteps echoed outside. The figure was back. The footsteps outside grew louder, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. Mike gripped his torch tightly, his knuckles white as he stared at the door. Zoe backed into a corner, shaking uncontrollably and muttering, "It's here! It's here!" Rachel clung to Liam, her breath shallow as the whispers began again, this time inside the cabin. The carvings on the walls seemed to glow faintly, pulsating in rhythm with the whispers. The journal on the table flipped open on its own, pages fluttering wildly before stopping. Liam read aloud, "To escape, you must give it what it wants." "What does it want?" Rachel cried, tears streaming down her face. Before anyone could answer, the door burst open, and the shadowy figure stood there, motionless. Its glowing eyes scanned the room as if deciding who to take. The figure stepped into the cabin, its presence sucking the air out of the room. Mike swung his torch at it desperately, but the flames extinguished instantly as it approached. Zoe screamed as she was lifted off the ground by an invisible force, her body convulsing mid-air. "Let her go!" Liam shouted, grabbing at her legs, but he couldn't pull her down. The figure raised a long, skeletal hand and pointed at Zoe before speaking for the first time. Its voice was deep and guttural. "She belongs to me now." Zoe's eyes rolled back into her head as her body went limp and fell to the floor. Rachel sobbed uncontrollably as Liam checked Zoe's pulse. She was alive but unconscious. "You can't have her," Mike yelled, stepping forward with nothing left to lose. The figure turned its attention to him, and Mike froze as shadows began crawling up his legs. Mike screamed as the shadows engulfed him completely, pulling him into the floorboards. His cries echoed through the cabin before fading into silence. He was gone. Rachel collapsed to her knees, unable to process what had just happened. "We have to finish this," Liam said firmly, picking up the journal again for answers. One page had new writing scrawled across it. A sacrifice must be made. Liam's stomach churned as he realized what it meant. One of them had to stay behind. "No," Rachel whispered, shaking her head violently. "There has to be another way." But Zoe suddenly sat up, her eyes glowing faintly like the carvings on the walls. "It won't stop until it gets what it wants," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. Liam looked at Rachel and knew what he had to do. "I'll stay," Liam said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. Rachel grabbed his arm desperately. "No. We'll find another way. We can't leave you." But Liam shook his head and handed her the journal. "You need to get out of here." The carvings on the walls glowed brighter as if responding to his decision. Zoe stood up slowly, her movements stiff and unnatural like a puppet on strings. "The forest accepts your offer," she said in that eerie voice before collapsing again. The shadowy figure stepped back into the doorway and gestured for Rachel to leave. Tears streamed down her face as she hesitated but finally turned toward Zoe and helped her up. "Liam," Rachel whispered one last time before running out of the cabin with Zoe in tow. As they disappeared into the woods, Liam faced the figure alone. The shadowy figure loomed over Liam, its glowing eyes fixed on him intently. "You are brave," it said in that guttural voice that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. Liam stood tall despite his trembling hands and asked, "What happens now?" The figure raised its skeletal hand again and pointed at him without answering directly. Shadows began swirling around Liam's feet like smoke rising from a fire. He felt coldness seep into his body as if something was draining his very essence away. Images flashed through his mind, memories of his friends laughing around the campfire earlier that night. Then came darker memories, Mike being pulled into oblivion, Zoe's lifeless expression, Rachel's tears as she left him behind. "You will stay," the figure said simply before everything went black around Liam. Rachel and Zoe stumbled through the forest in silence until they saw sunlight breaking through the trees ahead. They emerged from Blackwood Forest onto an empty road where their car was still parked nearby. Neither of them spoke as they climbed inside and drove away without looking back. But even miles away from Blackwood Forest, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When she glanced at Zoe sitting silently beside her, something seemed off. Zoe's reflection in the rearview mirror didn't match her movements. It was smiling. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she tried to focus on the road ahead. "Zoe," she asked cautiously, gripping the steering wheel tighter. Her friend turned to face her, but her eyes were glowing faintly like the carvings in the cabin. "You didn't really think it would let us leave, did you?" Zoe said with a twisted grin. Rachel slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop in the middle of the empty road. She scrambled out of the car, her heart racing as Zoe, or whatever Zoe had become, stayed inside. "You can't run," Zoe said calmly, her voice echoing unnaturally from within the vehicle. The forest behind Rachel seemed to stretch closer, its shadows reaching out toward her like claws. She turned and ran down the road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between her and the car. But no matter how far she ran, the trees seemed to follow, their whispers growing louder in her ears. When she finally stopped to catch her breath, she realized she was standing back at the clearing where it all began. The campfire was still there, smoldering faintly, and Liam's voice echoed faintly in the distance. "Rachel, Tears streamed down her face as she fell to her knees, realizing there was no escape. Blackwood Forest had claimed them all. It always did. Mark was exhausted after driving for hours along a desolate highway late at night. The neon sign of Sunset Inn flickered in the distance, offering him a brief sense of relief. The motel looked old and run down, but Mark didn't care. He just needed a place to sleep. The receptionist, an older man with a strange smile, handed him the key to room 13. "You're lucky," the man said cryptically. "That room doesn't get many visitors anymore." Mark didn't think much of it as he carried his bag down the dimly lit hallway. Room 13 was at the very end, its door slightly scratched as if someone had clawed at it. Inside, the air was stale, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. The bed looked clean enough, but something about the room felt off. Mark shrugged it off and decided to take a quick shower before going to bed. As Mark stepped into the bathroom, he noticed something strange about the mirror. It was cracked in one corner, and faint smudges covered its surface, like handprints from the inside. He turned on the faucet, but instead of water, a thick red liquid dripped out for a moment before clearing. "Old pipes," he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the growing unease in his chest. After his shower, he lay on the bed and turned on the TV to drown out his thoughts. Static filled the screen before an old news broadcast appeared unexpectedly. The headline read, "Murder at Sunset Inn, Room 13." Mark's stomach dropped as he stared at the screen. The broadcast showed police tape around a motel room door, his room door. He scrambled to turn off the TV, but it wouldn't respond to the remote or buttons. Suddenly, he heard faint knocking coming from inside the closet. Mark froze as the knocking grew louder, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone trapped inside. "Hello," he called out nervously, inching toward the closet door with hesitant steps. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, half expecting someone, or something, to jump out. When he opened it, there was nothing inside but an empty coat hanger swaying slightly. Relieved but still uneasy, Mark closed the door and tried to convince himself it was just his imagination. He climbed back into bed and turned off the lights, hoping sleep would come quickly. But as soon as he closed his eyes, he heard faint whispers coming from all around him. They were indistinct at first but grew clearer. "Get out. You shouldn't be here." Mark sat up abruptly and turned on the lamp, but now there were scratches on the walls that hadn't been there before. Deep gouges spelled out one chilling word: "Stay." Mark's breath quickened as he stared at the scratches on the wall in disbelief. He grabbed his phone to call someone, anyone, but there was no signal in room 13. Frustrated and scared, he decided to leave immediately and pack up his things. But when he tried opening the door to leave, it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. "Let me out," Mark shouted, pounding on the door until his fists hurt. The whispers returned louder this time, overlapping voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. He spun around and saw something horrifying. His reflection in the cracked mirror wasn't moving with him anymore. Instead, it stood still, staring back at him with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Mark backed away from the mirror as his reflection raised its hand and pointed toward him accusingly. Then came an ear-piercing scream from inside his own head. Mark stumbled back, clutching his head as the scream echoed inside his skull. The room felt smaller now, the walls seeming to close in on him. He turned toward the door again, desperate to escape, but it still wouldn't open. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony of voices that made no sense. Then, the closet door creaked open slowly on its own, revealing darkness far deeper than it should have been. Mark's flashlight flickered as he aimed it toward the closet, but the beam didn't penetrate the void. From that darkness emerged a single hand, pale and skeletal, gripping the edge of the doorframe. Mark froze in terror as a figure began to crawl out, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was obscured by long matted hair, but its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have come here," It rasped in a voice that sounded like gravel grinding together. Mark grabbed a chair and threw it at the creature, but it passed through as if it weren't solid. The figure tilted its head and let out a guttural laugh that sent chills down his spine. Panicking, Mark backed into the corner of the room, clutching his phone like a lifeline. The creature crawled closer, its limbs bending at impossible angles as it moved. "Leave me alone," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with fear. The creature stopped abruptly and pointed toward the bed with one long, bony finger. Mark hesitated before glancing at the bed, and saw something horrifying beneath it. A pair of glowing eyes stared back at him from the shadows under the mattress. Suddenly, he felt cold hands grip his ankles and yank him to the ground violently. Mark screamed as he was dragged toward the closet's gaping darkness. With all his strength, Mark kicked free from whatever was pulling him and scrambled to his feet. The closet door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, silencing the whispers momentarily. His chest heaved as he leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath. But then he noticed something new: photographs scattered across the floor near his feet. Each photo showed room 13 at different points in time, always empty but eerily pristine. In one photo, Mark saw himself standing by the bed, even though he hadn't been there before tonight. "What is this?" he muttered to himself, flipping through more photos with trembling hands. One picture showed the creature crawling out of the closet behind someone else, a man who looked terrified. On the back of that photo were scribbled words, "It takes what it wants." Mark dropped the photos as faint knocking started again, from beneath the floorboards this time. The knocking grew louder and more frantic, as if something was trying to break through below him. Mark backed away from the spot where the sound was coming from, his heart racing wildly. Suddenly, cracks began forming on the floorboards, spreading like spiderwebs across the room. From those cracks seeped a dark liquid, thick and tar-like, that pulsed unnaturally under his feet. The liquid began forming shapes on the floor, letters spelling out, "Stay forever." Mark shook his head violently, shouting, "No, I'm not staying here," as he searched for another way out. The bathroom door creaked open slightly, revealing a faint light coming from within. Desperate for any chance of escape, Mark ran into the bathroom and slammed the door shut behind him. But when he turned around, he wasn't in a bathroom anymore. It was another version of room 13. This one was decayed and rotting, with blood smeared across its walls. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the decayed version of room 13. The walls pulsed faintly, as if alive, and the blood smeared across them seemed fresh. The bed was broken, its mattress torn open with stuffing spilling out like entrails. On the floor, he saw a trail of footprints leading toward the closet, bare, wet, and human. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now. "It's your turn. Your turn." Mark turned to the door he had just come through, but it was gone, replaced by another wall. He spun around frantically, trying to find an exit, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly. Then he heard it again, the knocking, this time coming from inside the mirror. Mark approached cautiously, his reflection staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. But then his reflection moved on its own, raising a hand to point toward the bed. Mark hesitated before stepping closer to the bed, his legs trembling beneath him. The torn mattress shifted slightly as if something was moving underneath it. "Don't look," a voice whispered faintly in his ear, but Mark couldn't stop himself. He reached out and lifted the edge of the mattress, revealing a gaping hole beneath it. The hole was impossibly deep, filled with darkness that seemed to swallow all light. From within came faint cries, voices pleading for help and screaming in agony. Mark stumbled back as a hand shot out of the hole, grabbing at his ankle. It was cold and skeletal, its grip tightening as it tried to pull him closer to the edge. He kicked desperately, breaking free just as more hands began emerging from the darkness. The whispers turned into deafening screams. "Stay with us!" Mark scrambled to the other side of the room, his back pressed against the pulsating wall. The hands continued clawing their way out of the hole, dragging twisted figures with them. Each figure looked human but horribly distorted, faces stretched unnaturally and limbs bent at odd angles. They crawled toward Mark slowly, their hollow eyes fixed on him with unrelenting hunger. "You can't leave," one of them rasped, its voice echoing like it came from deep underwater. Mark grabbed a broken piece of wood from the bed frame and swung it wildly at them. The figures recoiled momentarily but kept advancing, their movements jerky and unnatural. Desperate, Mark shouted at the room itself, "What do you want from me?" The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a single voice that came from everywhere at once. "You." The floor beneath him cracked open again, revealing more of that endless void. Mark felt himself being pulled toward the void as if gravity itself had shifted against him. He grabbed onto the edge of a dresser, holding on for dear life as the figures closed in. "You can't fight it," one of them hissed, its face inches away from his own now. Mark's grip slipped slightly as he felt cold hands grabbing at his legs again. In a final act of desperation, he remembered the lighter in his pocket and pulled it out. He flicked it on and held it toward one of the figures. It recoiled violently from the flame. Realizing fire was his only weapon, Mark lit a piece of fabric from the bed frame on fire. The flames spread quickly across the room, consuming everything in their path, including the figures. As smoke filled the air and heat pressed against his skin, Mark felt himself falling backward into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he was lying on the highway outside Sunset Inn. Mark gasped for air as headlights approached him, another car pulling into the motel parking lot. He stumbled to his feet and waved frantically at the driver to stop before they went inside. "You can't stay here," Mark shouted desperately as they rolled down their window. The driver looked confused but concerned as Mark tried to explain what had happened to him. But when Mark turned back toward Sunset Inn, it wasn't there anymore. The lot was empty. No, Mark muttered under his breath, running toward where room 13 should have been. All that remained was an empty patch of dirt surrounded by silence. The motel had vanished completely. The driver sped off nervously after seeing Mark collapse onto his knees in disbelief. As Mark sat there alone under the moonlight, he heard faint whispers carried on the wind again. "We'll be back." And somewhere far away, Sunset Inn waited patiently for its next guest.